Thanks for coming tonight. This is part of our Changemakers Under 30 series, and I wanted to give a special thank you to Tristan Pollock and to Kristen Brown from the Chronicle for being with us. So I'm going to pass this on to Tristan.
Hi guys, how's it going tonight? Yeah, it's coming up. Okay, is that better? So we're gonna chat tonight with Tristan, who is COO and co-founder of Storefront, and then after we chat, we're gonna open it up for questions because I'm sure you all have many questions for him. So let's start off, Tristan, just hearing a little bit about, why you started Storefront. What was it that you were seeing in the marketplace that made it seem like this was a company that needed to happen?
That's what's always funny because we're a marketplace, and I work with a lot of marketplace companies. I also work with 500 startups as an EAR, so it's like marketplace in the marketplace. Meta marketplace. But so when we were thinking, Eric and my co-founder and I were thinking about Storefront, we basically came from this area of like our families have basically been doing storefront-esque things for a long time. So my parents are artists, my dad still runs a design shop, and a lot of our friends and family were opening up spaces like pop-up galleries and stores, even like long-term stores that were going on, so they're signing a 5 or 10 year lease. And we basically saw a huge problem in the supply, where 1 in 10 stores is sitting vacant in the US today. And that's still true. It was true 2 years ago when we started Storefront. And so that was a huge issue. We're like, okay, there's all this vacant space. It's a huge opportunity. And why don't we get the most creative people in the world into those spaces? And so what we figured out was like, okay, there's also 28 million small businesses out there, small businesses and entrepreneurs that are 1/6 of which are creative in the creative industry. And so if you're thinking about the artists, the designers, the brands of the world, everyone that's emerging is looking to grow brand awareness and reach new customers and get more sales, and yet there's all this empty space that they're not using because it's too expensive and they don't want to sign a 5 or 10 year lease, which is pretty traditional in retail leasing. So we basically like, all right, how can we connect those two things? And that was kind of the genesis.
And you had one friend in particular who was sort of in need of what you ended up building, right? Tell us about that.
Yeah, exactly. So one friend in particular, her name was Jennifer. She wanted to set up a pop-up gallery. This is in Minneapolis, where I grew up. Eric and I grew up in Minnesota, and before we moved out here and went through AngelPad and with Storefront. But she wanted to set up a pop-up art gallery for a couple months, and she ended up talking to 20 different commercial brokers, 10 different insurance providers, and then ended up renting it longer and paying more than she wanted to. And so we were like, okay, there's a huge problem here. Like, the people that are actually doing this and filling these spaces while they're empty are running into all these roadblocks. They're having to cold call commercial brokers and pitch them what they're trying to do, and these people are, they haven't built a brand yet. They're not like, hey, I'm Best Buy and I'm gonna come in here and do this really cool experience. They're like, I'm Jennifer Kenzok, and I'm going to bring a bunch of local artists into this space. And they're like, oh, this is a very expensive asset. I don't really want to, I don't know if I trust you. And so that's what kind of led to like thinking about this more. And we've seen those same experiences happening over and over in major cities across the US, with that big number of this 1 in 10 stores sitting vacant.
So one thing I'm really curious about, pop-up shops have become really popular, especially the 1 or 2 day weekend pop-up shop kind of thing. Are most of the people using your product, are they just renting a store for a day or two, or is it more like a month to test out whether their business is viable? What's the deal? Who's your customer really?
Yeah, so there's two groups. One group is renting it for a weekend or a week, and they may be going to a vacant space, or they may be going into a established art gallery or retail space, basically established space that's willing to rent out for events. And so there's that group, and then there's also the group that's looking at vacant space, where usually where the best mesh is 1 to 3 months. And in total, we've seen everything from 1 day to 6 months rented on the platform, but generally see those two groups of people kind of going in and creating the experience that they want to create.
Gotcha. Okay, so I think we have a lot of entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs in the audience. Let's get a hand count. How many people out here are hoping to start their own business of some kind? Oh my gosh, like more than half. So then, I mean, this is the thing that always gets me about entrepreneurship. When I have an idea for a story, I'm just like, okay, I'm gonna call some people and make it happen. I have no idea what you do when you have a good business idea. It's just like, I have 7 good business ideas a day. I have no idea how I can make them happen. So once you have this idea and saw that there was a need, maybe you can walk us through how you made it a real thing.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, so out of those people who raised their hands, how many are like already working on it? How much is this idea and how many are already working on it? Okay. So it's pretty good. I mean, like 50% is like, you know, so I think like that's the biggest thing I always emphasize is like, okay, I'm not the biggest risk taker entrepreneur there is. And I actually didn't even really count myself as an entrepreneur for a while because I was just like, I don't know what that really means and I don't know if that's me. But it's all about like testing is what the biggest lesson that I've learned is like you can do things like, you know, you probably hear like MVP and you think about a product or you're like, okay, yeah, like I can build like a really basic thing, but even that's a big step. What's like the biggest like Storefront, the site started as basically like a sign up page. And we're like, hey, we're going to help you do this. We're gonna help you rent retail spaces short term. Are you interested? Like that was basically the first iteration of the site. So like, I think like, don't overthink it and don't try to think too big. Like it's good to think big, but you don't have to act big right away. And so you can do very small things. Like, you know, like we started by talking to people like Jennifer and saying like, okay, like we feel like this is a problem. Is this actually a problem? Eventually we opened up our own pop-up in Westfield, San Francisco, right over here. And then, you know, and during that time too, we like had our sign-up page, landing page. And so I think there's all these little small things you can do to try to test things out and continue to keep yourself excited about what you want to work on, and see if it's like something that, you know, you feel like there's like a fit there, like there's a need for it. And so you'll start to get a better feeling about that if people are constantly like, you know, with Storefront, people are constantly saying, hey, I would love to use this all the time. Like, and we saw that support, and we could kind of grow off that momentum by just doing these little things here and there. So I think it's like, that's the biggest thing, I guess, is like, you can start small. Start small, think about the smallest, easiest thing you can do. All right, I'll start with a conversation. I'll start telling people about my idea. Then maybe I'll put up a landing page, or maybe I'll start writing about it. Or write about it for the Chronicle. I don't know, you know? So it's like I think there's like ways you can work up to it and like start to build momentum.
Yeah, I think when we talked earlier, even though you are kind of the Airbnb of storefronts, you mentioned that you don't have to go into it thinking I will be the Airbnb of X. You don't have to think of it as I'm going to start a massive technology company or a massive commerce company, which I really liked. So
and your X for Y has to make sense too.
What's an X for Y that doesn't make sense?
So like many publications, including the New York Times, call us the Airbnb for retail. But a lot of people are like, hey, I'm just Uber for whatever because they're successful, you know. But it has to make sense, right? Otherwise, that statement has no meaning whatsoever.
Yeah, I got pitched an Uber for vacuums, and I'll be fair, I didn't read the whole email, but I totally have no idea what that means still. Uber for
Did they bring the
vacuums.
vacuums to you?
I don't think so, and why wouldn't you just own your own vacuum? It was very strange. I've never needed a vacuum on demand. Maybe someone to do the vacuuming on demand, but anyways. Okay, so you guys have raised $8.9 million, and you were founded in 2012, right? But you're still pretty small. You're only in 2 cities. So, I mean, how do you go about strategically expanding? What's the plan? What's on the horizon line for you guys?
Yeah. So 2 cities. We're in four total now. Two new ones last year.
Okay.
So being a B2B marketplace in kind of this B2B sharing economy, we've grown a little bit slower, but grown very quickly in certain centralized urban areas. So we like Airbnb, you know, like if you think like I'm spending maybe $200 to $400 maybe when I'm traveling to a place and when I'm renting a space on Airbnb versus like on average, someone's spending maybe $2,000 to $5,000 with storefronts. So that, in that sense, like we haven't had to scale to different cities as quickly. But right now we're in New York, San Francisco, LA, and Chicago. New York being the biggest, San Francisco being the first. And so basically, like we kind of have our roadmap of like, hey, here are the cities we want to go to. But really, for us, again, it's the most important cities are the cities that have a lot of foot traffic, a lot of urban density, and they also have our biggest categories like fashion, art, and design. And so, also, there's another dynamic to think about, at least for the marketplace like us, where we do a city-by-city launch, is that there's a kind of a local to local, like all of our supply is local, right? All the spaces are in the city. But then when you're looking at who the demand is and who's renting these spaces, you have local makers, artists, designers in the city that are renting space in the city, but then you also have like international or national brands coming into certain cities, and that's another factor that we think about is like, people are going to New York much more, they have a much more like national, international focus, so the demand isn't all local. But we see like a huge demand in general with every city that has any sort of city center, town square, because there's people looking to get in those spaces that aren't ready to lease 5 or 10-year lease.
And how do you know when it's time to go into a new market and that market is right for you? I know that's a really hard balance when you're starting a company, because you don't want to grow too slowly, but at the same time, growing too fast, you could get in over your head very quickly. That's happened to a lot of companies.
Testing again. So. One thing we do is when people are searching on the site, we know what people are searching for, right? So we're always monitoring and saying, okay, like, is someone typing in Minneapolis a million times? Is somebody, what's Minneapolis versus Chicago? And when they're looking for space on the site, they're looking to rent. So we can kind of gauge that demand specifically for our use case, right? We can also look at like general terms like the census data of like, what's the population of certain areas, what's the general income, what sort of businesses are most popular in those areas. But we can most of the data that's most important is from our own gathering, and so that helps us kind of like lay out this roadmap of like, all right, here's the places the most important to go. And sometimes the one thing that we've danced around with is like, even should we go international faster, because London is actually a bigger market for people doing this than Atlanta. And I think there's a strong case for that, because even though it's harder to launch internationally, a city like London has so much more potential and is so much more developed for what we're doing.
So you mentioned London, and I think that you have some competitors there, right? Some local companies. So who are your competitors? Who are you up against right now?
Yeah. So probably companies that you don't quite know yet, because we're all kind of building this market together. I see like short-term retail is like it's a fairly new, under-researched market, but it's something that's been around a long time. If you think like back to the bazaars of the Middle East, it's short-term, right? Like it's like critical mass of people like over a weekend. And so that's been happening for a long time. And just the market started to become more developed when people started recognizing that, hey, pop-up shops and pop-up retail, and that's really interesting. I want to try that. But even before that, like Toys R Us was doing 300 stores every Christmas for 3 months, and like they just didn't call it a certain term. So I think that it's kind of been developing for a while, and that's kind of the angle that we approach it with. I don't know if that quite answers.
I think that mostly answers it. So starting a company and not just starting a company, but continuing to run a company is stressful. So tell us about what's keeping you up at night right now. What do you wake up in the middle of the night fretting over?
Yeah, I think there's we were talking a little bit about this before, but I think like there's a very sometimes underreported story of like all the hard things that a lot of big companies have went through, or like companies that have like so-called made it. If you think about like Airbnb, or I don't know, HomeJoy, or even like Meerkat. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Meerkat or meerkatting, but like there's like a lot of hard things that come with a company, and a lot of things that keep you up at night. And I don't know, it's like not, it's hard, sometimes it's hard to articulate it, But I think those stories don't always get told enough. So I mean, like things like there's always a lot of ups and ups and downs can be related to, you know, how the team is functioning together and how you guys are working together. It could relate to how your growth is, and like when you take on venture capital, and always like stipulate is like there's a lot of different ways you can grow your business, and you could grow it to try to grow revenue and bootstrap it and not take any outside financing and keep all of your ownership. Oftentimes here in San Francisco, we think straight to like, all right, I need to raise money. It doesn't matter where I'm at with the company, what I understand, what I don't. I just like, yeah, I have an idea, I want to get some money. And so I think that's one thing that can make it, you know, when you do raise venture capital, you need to grow incredibly fast. And like that's one of the big things. So you need to know like kind of where you're at when you raise, enough so that you're like, all right, I'm going to grow like 30% month over month. It's kind of the golden number. But that's like you don't just see like this, right? Like you see like this. And so like, you know, all like the major success stories, there's actually very few where people just took off, like, you know, Facebook or whatever. And even Facebook, like there's plenty of things where they like had clashes with teams, and like, you know, other people that used to be on their cap table, now they're not, and legal contracts and lawyers, and like and other competitors. And so I don't know. I mean, it's a kind of a long-winded answer, but like there's just a lot of things that are happening all the time, and it literally is a startup roller coaster. Like one minute you could be super happy, and the next minute and you get an email and you're like, this is like horrible. So it takes a lot of grinding, I guess, to get a lot of persistence.
So, you know, maybe you'll tell us about the last horrible email you got then.
I don't know. I mean, like good emails are like, hey, I got covered by the SF Chronicle. Bad emails are like, I don't know, someone you know, we haven't had any like Airbnb fallouts, but like sometimes people like don't have a great experience, right? And you're like, you know, like how do we figure this out and like become better at creating the product and the experience? So when someone's going through Storefront, they're like, every time, you know, they're like, I feel like that customer delight, you know, something like Tony Hsieh at Zappos talks a lot about, and I believe a lot in that. So I don't know. I mean, there's emails like that. They're like, hey, I showed up, nobody walked in my store. It was a horrible experience. But you know, the more you kind of think and you pay attention to those things, you know, that's where that persistence kicks in. Because like, even though things are stressful, it's also like hopefully you surround yourself with really great people. And I think people is what makes companies. And sometimes people are like, oh, you know, like emotions are not separate, or separate from companies or separate from business. But at the end of the day, we're all people and we all have emotions. So I don't know if I agree with those sort of things. It's just like you need the right team to kind of keep that persistence going, because even when it's bad, you can still laugh about it.
So, so you mentioned your customers and, you know, interacting with them, and sometimes they have a hard time and don't get the business they want. What's interesting to me about you guys is you're a sharing economy company, but you're a B2B one, and there's not a lot of those out there. So what's different about interacting with a business customer versus, you know, a consumer like Uber's customers or like Airbnb's customers?
I mean, I think a large one is we can afford to take more time with our customers, if that makes sense. Like, our customers are people spending a lot more money and have a lot more riding on us. Like, they're growing their own business. Like, we're a small business serving small businesses most of the time. Like, yeah, we've worked with Kanye West or Nike or Target, but like most of the time we're serving people that are actually very similar, at least structurally look like Storefront. So that can be like one of the biggest differences is like there's a lot that comes with that, right? People are maxing out credit cards and putting all their own money and taking out loans and trying to make this work. And so like we really need to come through on our promise to them, because we could make basically how we look at it is like we're going to make some of the next great fashion businesses or the next great artists, because they're going to have access to the distribution channel they didn't have before. And so we kind of look and target those sorts of people who are like on the cusp of like, all right, it's never been easier to start your business online. I have Etsy, I have Square, Shopify, whatever, Twitter and YouTube to promote it. I have all these great tools, but I never had this avenue to get to offline into my own community where people, like, things are becoming more localized and people appreciate locally made things, locally made food. And so now I have this avenue to get in here and do it like year round in all these different unique spaces all around the city. And so like that comes with like a high regard for us to really respect that like people are putting out, maybe I'm spending $2,000 to rent this space, so I need to, you know, get X amount of brand awareness or make X amount of sales. So we really have to try to make sure we're putting people in the right places in a city so that they can have the right foot traffic, so we can come through our promise of making this work for them and allowing them to do this over and over again.
Have you guys tracked at all how many of the entrepreneurs who use your service go on to start their own full-time brick and mortar locations? Is that something you've paid attention to?
Yeah. So it's been a smaller percentage, but I'd say like it's started to happen more and more frequently because people will use it as testing, and they'll say, okay, I want to try out this area or this side of the street or this city and see if it works. And so, I mean, some people like Uniqlo, for example, like before they actually opened their full-time store, they had a pop-up store in a different location in the city. Indochino, which now has a store over near Union Square, it's a men's custom suit company. They've used us for a few different pop-ups in San Francisco and New York, and they basically did like 3 pop-ups here before they actually went long-term, and now they started to do longer-term stores. So we're seeing that happen more and more often, and especially as businesses mature. It's usually a little bit mature businesses. But there's also stories of like Christina Ruiz. I don't know if anyone goes into Crocker Galleria, but she has a store in there called Top Shelf, and she started out. She actually got a Kiva loan because they do U.S. loans now, and then opened up a food truck because she didn't want to sign a 5 or 10 year lease. And then, or not a food truck, but like took a food truck and brought her fashion in it, so like a fashion truck. And then she brought that around, like got it wrapped really nice and brought it around to all the festivals that were happening, all the city festivals in the city. And then she was able to like test a pop-up shop that we actually got for Store Envy, because she was also selling online with Store Envy. And then she was able to like from there get into another space in Crocker Galleria. And now she's thinking about expanding to one other store in the city. So I think that's probably a good example of like, hey, like I'm like building my business, and then the stories that we're seeing more and more often.
That's very cool. So Square also built its business up around supporting and enabling smaller businesses, and you know they've moved into providing a variety of services for small businesses, including actual loans, right? Do you see Storefront eventually providing other services to entrepreneurs aside from just connecting them with temporary space?
Yeah, so I look at it as like 3-step process. Like first step is I need to find these spaces, because before I was walking the streets and cold calling brokers or approaching people and they didn't really know what I was selling or who I was. And then the second step is the basically the rental process is like I need insurance, so now Storefront provides insurance for free. I need to sign a rental contract. I was like always still using pen and paper for a long time. Now you can sign online. Like then I was using a check to pay the landlord or the broker, and now you can just pay online. So like we kind of streamlined those first 2 steps, and that's what we're really good at. Eventually, like again back to testing, like we basically have partnerships with different service providers. So if you need a temporary retail staff, like people that are have worked in retail and are willing to work at your store for a week or a month, like we have service providers you can go to for that. So or like I need retail design or anything, I need fixtures and furniture, whatever. So like we can basically direct people to those services as that 3rd step. But I think there's definitely parts of that where we could actually maybe at some point Storefront owns a space and we already have all that stuff that can like be manipulated and moved, and it's a really great spot in the city, and so we can better think about that. So I think that could be kind of the route it goes.
So it's sort of like a WeWork model, but for retail.
Potentially, yeah. Potentially it could go that way, or maybe there's a package that we offer that has everything you need to move into a vacant space, and all you need to do is think about your design and set it up.
you mentioned the struggle when you're starting a company. You know, do I try and bootstrap it? Do I take on a bunch of funding? You guys have only raised 2 rounds, right, in your time, and a fairly modest sum for San Francisco, actually. It's funny because I've always thought that anything besides bootstrapping is sort of antithetical to what I think of as the entrepreneurial spirit. So how did you decide what to do as far as fundraising? What guided you for the folks out there thinking about their own ventures?
Yeah. So short history of storefront fundraising. So we kind of initially started in Minnesota. I don't think like a lot of people know that, but that was when we started concepting. We built an MVP and got into AngelPad that at the time was still based over in Soma. Now they're in New York. And when we went through AngelPad, we kind of got situated here in the city, and then we're kind of set on that trajectory. I'd say like we thought this was a really big idea. Thought it is applicable to most cities across the world, and so that's kind of and we're like, okay, we're gonna grow this like faster than anyone else. And so going through AngelPad in those 10 weeks, and then basically raising our seed round a few months after that, and then a year later raising our A round, that's always kind of been the mentality. It's like we're gonna do this better than anyone else. We're gonna build a really scalable platform that we can then bring across the world, and we're gonna do it faster. And so that was kind of the thinking of like, we need to do this. Now, there's probably other human factors in there too. Also, like, we didn't have a lot, we had self-financed about as much as we could for that business and the previous one that we had worked on. And so we also needed money to like support ourselves and the people that we were hiring, right? And so like, I don't know, there's kind of a give and take there of like, you definitely, but I guess the bigger picture is like we wanted to grow it big.
Gotcha. So I did not know that you guys started in Minnesota, actually. That's very interesting. So having come from elsewhere to here, how necessary do you think it is if you're starting a tech company to be in San Francisco? What's the benefit of being here?
I think the one thing that's always stood out and comes through again and again is like how willing founders that have been in your shoes, like, and now they're like growing a business, are willing to sit down and have like a coffee with you. I feel like not enough people talk about how amazing it is here, like the founder ecosystem and people working on stuff. And like, like for example, like the guys at Thumbtack, like, they've just raised $100 million from Google, nicest guys ever. Like before we had done anything of interest, they were willing to like talk to me and like say, hey, here's like some of the marketplace things that we've run into and like we figured out. Like here's some approaches you should think about while you're doing this. So I think like that part right there is this like this. There's so many people doing things like this and like have like done it or like run into these challenges or like you. That sort of the ecosystem here is pretty strong, of course, and there's like it's strongest for investors here too. And like if you are looking to grow a huge business, here are people that that will support you and like are a little bit. I would say like the checkbook's a little bit more open than if you go to New York and then if you go to London, where people are more focused on not as important things like revenue and and having a built product and things like that. But
can we get on the record that you just said not as important things like revenue? Let's hope you're.
That was sarcastic.
Okay.
That was sarcastic. Very
okay.
important things and just I think there's just a great culture around ideas and passion. And if you are thoughtful and you think about things and you approach people in a very thoughtful way, then a lot of good things can happen to you.
So, and you sort of give back to that culture because you're an entrepreneur in residence at 500 Startups, right? So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what are the lessons you've taken from starting your company that you try and impart upon the entrepreneurs you work with?
Yeah, so at 500, we have a new office here in the city over at 4th and Mission. So as an entrepreneur in residence there, I mentor a lot of the marketplace companies, as well as a few other companies, but marketplace is most applicable because that's what I've spent the last 2 years kind of doing that startup grind on. So, there's a whole wide range of it. I think a lot of it is like kind of like Silicon Valley etiquette, like one thing about 500 is they have a strong focus on diversity, and so that means like 20% female founders, 40% international, and that's in the current batch right now out of 35 companies. And so like that's a lot. I pretty much have this like empathetic side for people that are coming to the Valley or like are doing this for the first time because of that like transition from the Midwest to here. And all the things that I learned in like my first year out here, like, you know, the help from the other founders, like the help with some accelerator programs. 500 was also an investor in Storefront in both of our rounds. And so all that stuff, like I try to, I guess, impart on people coming here and trying to get their business off the ground. And so it's like, hey, you know, like here's how you ask for an intro, or like here's how you get coffee, here's how you guess a founder's email and actually get him to get coffee with you. Like it's like
how do you do those things?
If not everyone here isn't using Reportive, please use it. There was a pretty weak reaction there. You guys definitely need to use Reportive. It was bought by LinkedIn recently, and it basically like shows you people's profiles when you're in Gmail. Think of like rapport. 2 P's, Reportive. Yeah. So I don't know. Yeah, I mean, there's that. I mean, there's like constantly. I mean, also like we're in like the hot zone of so many interesting things happening. We could be like the laziest people ever. We could never leave our apartment or our office with all the services that we have and all the new apps being tested on us. Another one recently I was using it's called Conspire, and that one's pretty cool. It's like basically you connect your inbox and it shows your signal strength to people, so you can find your way to like, let's say Mark Cuban is an example on our homepage. You know, so you're like, oh, okay, like I email very frequently and very recently with this person, so I have a pretty strong signal. This person does that same thing with Mark. Okay, cool. So I think there's just like a lot of interesting networking things, going back to that other previous question too, like where this makes it very easy to get the right resources you need to start a lucrative business.
So are there any mistakes in particular that you guys have made with Storefront that you'd be open to sharing, stuff that you've learned from?
No. No, I think I mean, fundraising is like something to be very thoughtful about. Like you know, especially when you raise from like VCs, you know, and so you kind of have like, you have, you know, your angels, you have your super angels, you have your micro VCs, kind of like 500 that do a lot of small investments, and you have like big VCs who actually are only doing like 10, 20, maybe 30 investments a year. So they don't really make that many investments. So when they do, they really have a lot of high expectations for what you are going to bring for them. So I'd say like be thoughtful about like how you want to grow your business and like what sort of business it is. And it's fine. Like I think one thing that's undervalued here is like there are awesome businesses that maybe aren't like, you know, crazy growth VC scalable. That, you know, there's like a lot of undervalued businesses that are actually very awesome that you don't need to get venture funding for. And so I'd say like be thoughtful about that. Like, you know, do you actually need that funding? You know, maybe you want to work with some angels that are really passionate about what you're doing and maintain a lot of control of the company. You know, so I think that was one lesson that, or at least one thing I've thought a lot about is like how and when to start finding capital for your business. And then as far as like, I mean, other mistakes, like I think like the 2 biggest things I get asked about at 500 is like fundraising and growth. And I think you need to make mistakes on the growth side of it. Like fundraising, you don't really need, you know, it's like you have enough time to plan. There's like there aren't as many dynamics as growth and how it's specific to your business and all the channels you can try. So like fundraising, you have less excuses to fuck up on. On the growth side of it, you need to screw up. You need to like try things and see what happens and keep doing those little tests and then see like what can you do to actually like leverage that. It's like, you know, we always call it pulling the levers. You know, it's like, can I actually pull this lever more, or do I need to hire 10 people to actually pull that lever? You know, can I just pull it myself and you know, basically like, can I put more money into AdWords and I know that I'm gonna get like paid this much for a customer and they're gonna come in and give me this much and the economics make sense. It's like finding those things, I think a lot of times are sometimes what people can struggle the most with, but that's what you need to really get a venture-backed business going, because you need to know, hey, these are like my top 3 channels and I can just like pull these levers, and if I had more money and more people, like we would be able to just like turn it up. And so I think that's the biggest challenge, or like sometimes the biggest mistake is people not understanding those correctly, or understanding the dynamics of like even before those like acquisition channels, why are people renting? Like Airbnb, it took them a while, and then they're like, oh, people are like travel when there's a big event in the city, and like finding out those sort of dynamics. And like for example, we have a startup in 500 right now called Van Gogh. It's a marketplace for original art. They were finding a way to help artists price better so that people can purchase a cheaper piece, and then they'll start buying more expensive pieces now that they've had a taste of it. And so it's interesting to see those dynamics. The biggest thing is like, when do people buy art? Is it because they're moving? Is it because like they're changing their apartment out and keeping it fresh? I don't know. It's like trying to figure out some of those dynamics, not only where people are coming from, but why, can be the biggest challenge, or sometimes mistake if you don't figure it out right.
So let's talk about testing. You guys said that you're always testing. What's an example of a test that you've done and decided to not pursue? That the test has showed you shouldn't go in that direction, and why did you decide to not do that?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, the first thing that comes to mind is an example from another company that recently that I looked up to a lot early on in Storefront, called 42 Floors. And recently they decided they basically went to like, okay, we're going to be like a very efficient broker to help people like rent space, like as far as office space most of the time, faster and better and easier. And then they ended up totally pivoting off of that and not doing that. And I think the reason why they did that was like, they're like, okay, like you're constantly trying different things out in the business. And again, you have like, if you raise the sort of money that 42 Floors or Storefront has, you have one trajectory, and you have to grow really, really fast. And so you have to find like, what is that? And like, what's like the right product market fit that will allow us to grow in the really scalable way, right? Like, does Storefront act like, I guess one of the things is like, does Storefront, you could call our test of renting that space at Westfield, like, hey, do we want to be like a WeWork model and actually lease or own these spaces? Or do we want to create a platform that like makes it easy for everyone to do so, but we're not going to control the actual experience of the space? And the hypothesis there was like, okay, this part's really hard, and it's going to be super capital intensive if we rent and own every single real estate location that we need in a city, in the best areas in a city. And I don't know if people are that familiar with retail pricing, but like, it's usually 3x what office is. So it's incredibly expensive. If we had like a space down in Union Square, you might be paying $50,000 a month for that space. New York, even more, right? So that was like a factor that we were like, okay, like, we know how to do this. We know what all the factors that go into it by doing it, but we don't want to go this route. We want to create a technology platform. Like, we want to power this with tech. We don't want to power it with real estate. Because like, basically WeWork's a real estate business. They're not really a tech business. It's just kind of looked at.
Well, what is a tech business anymore, right? So when I think about companies that sell things to people, I think about them in two categories, right? There are companies that are trying to meet an existing demand, and then there are companies that are trying to create new buying habits, right? Like, I think of Bloom That as an interesting company because they're trying to get people to buy flowers not just at Mother's Day and Valentine's Day. So which are you guys? Are you operating within, existing demand for this, or are you trying to create this as a new option for people?
I think both for us, because we're one, like I was kind of talking about the dynamics of the retail industry changing, and it's going more towards experience, more towards going to where your customers are, more local. And even you see that in like City Target, right? Like, they're not trying to build a big Target in the middle of San Francisco. They're trying to build this smaller thing, and they're also trying to bring in like local effects, like whether it's local art, local fashion, or it's like locally branded stuff, right? And so like, one, we have these kind of trends going in our direction, but we're also like really creating what the trend is. Like a lot of people, like, there's a lot of like, everyone's like, haters gonna hate, right? Like, there are a lot of people that said we were like, this is not gonna work, that's not gonna work. Pop-up shops sound small, sounds like people like, I don't know what that is. I don't actually do the shopping, like most VCs are like older white males, right? Like do they understand retail? Not really. So we had to find really the right partners to bring on board that understood these dynamics and where it was going, and didn't get stuck up on like pop-up shops being a trend. And so that was kind of one of the things that I think is still a big challenge for us, because we're also, not only is it the market going this direction, but we're helping shape what that market means and what it is, including with our competitors and the competitors in other cities, or like the nonprofits trying to fill vacant space. I feel like we're all we need to work together to an extent, because it's not like any of us have made it. We're still trying to figure things out and see where this is going, and things can change so drastically, but we're trying to build a 100-year business at least.
So let's not go 100 years out, but let's go 10 years out. And what do you see? Do you see more people choosing to run short-term retail locations versus trying to open their own brick and mortar shop in the long term? Do you see there being a sort of inverse of what you're seeing now with some of your entrepreneurs?
Yeah, 100%. So like the Indochino example is interesting, where they basically did 2 years of nonstop pop-up shops that were driving somewhere around 30% of their revenue. And they would just they knew where people were from buying from them online, and they just wanted to go and give them a chance to get a tailor to give them a custom fit in person. So then anytime they want to come back and buy custom clothes, they have their professional measurements. And so you could go and touch and feel and get your measurements and all these things, and they would go from city to city based on where the most popular cities were that people were buying from them. And they did this basically for 3 weeks. They do it once a month for about 2 to 3 weeks. And so they did it over that 24 over 24 shops over 2 years, and they just now recently this one's a really lucrative market, so we're going to create a flagship store here, but we're still kind of moving on this path of testing and giving that experience. So I think more especially tech e-commerce companies that are starting, and they're all right, we're going to build our business in this way, and here's how it's scalable, are building a factor into their brand that actually needs to be experienced, and you actually need to go touch and feel it and talk to people, or go to an event that they host. And so, or like SK2, this Japanese beauty brand, has a super interesting story. They basically derive their main ingredient from sake, because in factories in Japan, sake factories, they had these old men, working at the sake factory, doing the startup grind, and they basically had their faces were super old, but their hands were super beautiful, and they're like, what's going on here? And so this basically created this company, and so they want to give you that experience in person, show how this can rejuvenate your skin. And they have this machine that you can put your face in, and it'll say, okay, here's where your skin is, your actual age of your skin. Here's where it's needs more help than others. Here's the things you can use with it. It's you can't really put your face up to a laptop and have it analyze you. Probably at some point, but that's the kind of experience I think we're seeing, and that's still very necessary. So even though e-commerce is going to continue to take a larger chunk of brick and mortar, still 90% plus of commerce is offline, and it's going to equal out. It's going to be this omni-channel, multi-channel thing where everything kind of comes together, and there are some things you want to show in person, there's some things that you need to do online.
It sounds like you're sort of painting a picture of a little bit of a backlash of buying everything online, which I've certainly experienced when I've bought the thing that looks really cute on madewell.com, and it does not look cute on me. So is that sort of what you're seeing?
Yeah, I think that's what it can be. Is you can have these temporary experiences to give people a chance to try things, and then understand the fit and the style, and then you can basically continue to buy online if you have that knowledge as their customer. So that's one example. Even I like to think though, we've also done stuff with Fusion.io, this big tech company, Zipcar. There's pretty much limitless applications if you need to talk to your customers. If you're trying for customer acquisition, you want to show someone your app, you want to demo and get feedback. There's just whether it's tech or fashion or art or design, there's just always an application for that. And a lot of times people want to get out from behind the scenes. They want to meet people once in a while. They want to be appreciated for all the hard work that they put into this, because again, they're a startup too.
Right, okay, so I'm going to ask you one last question, and then I'm going to kick it back to you guys to ask your questions of Tristan, so get your questions ready. Okay, so what is the thing that you keep hearing about your company that people get wrong? What is the biggest misconception? What drives you crazy that you hear about Storefront?
Airbnb for retail?
Really? So not accurate.
I think it's a good comparison, but honestly, so maybe this kind of bleeds into like where we're going, and it's turning more into something that is not going to be just purely transactional. It's going to allow a lot more access and connection in different ways. And so like one thing we're trying to like meld with the real estate industry, and so there's a lot of things there that are old and really mundane, and like it's very manual and non-efficient. And so we're basically trying to move in the direction of like we don't necessarily need to force people to do exactly like what Airbnb does, right? Like we're our own company and our own brand, and so that's kind of like you might see it more as like to use another X for Y, like more like a Trulia Airbnb for retail. So I don't know, that's kind of like, I'd say that's probably one thing we're going, is we're very sensitive about like how it's described. And so we also like stopped saying pop-up shop for a while, because a lot of people that we worked with, like our customers get it, but we didn't want to limit ourselves to where we can go with it. And so that's kind of the thought, is like, we have a very like aggressive and like long-winded plan of like where we're going to go with this, and like eventually it comes down to like we can actually tell people where where they should sell shoes, these types of shoes during this time of year on this street, and maybe even projected sales. Like, so I think like there's some really smart ways that we can build this into a system that actually helps you grow your business in a smarter way.
So it all comes back to the data. That's the takeaway.
Potentially.
Okay,
We'll
guys.
see.
Who has questions? Let's see. Okay, you in the striped shirt in the third row.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. So I actually talked to Storefront before as a e-commerce owner. It didn't work out. I think it's because you guys are specifically in the fashion and art space. Do you plan to expand to more people who actually have physical products?
What sort of product do you have?
So like imagine like a boutique in face value, it's kind of like Nordic design, contemporary home decor, and like displays, all that stuff. So it does kind of fashionable. So that's my first question.
Okay. So yeah, so the question was, you did a pop-up, it didn't work out the same way you wanted.
Oh no, you guys never even talked to me about it. Like I was willing to pay, but you didn't connect.
Okay. So I'd say like so it sounds like, so basically one thing about Storefront, I mean, we're a completely open marketplace, right? So we're not, like we were talking about before, we're not trying to be the middleman like WeWork. We're actually, the person that didn't talk to you is probably the space owner, which then that's one of like the things that kind of comes back to us, right? It's like, we're like, okay, we need to make sure people respond to each other, and that's the big challenge of a two-sided marketplace, because we have two customers and we need them to work together. And so how do we get them to work together? So I'd be happy to put you in touch with the right people. And what was your second question?
Second question is more startup and funding related. So like, you mentioned that a lot of VCs are older white male and they don't do shopping. Do you feel like that kind of mentality has changed after Pinterest got kind of big and then they realized maybe like women from the Midwest who are interested in marketplace could contribute to a very high net worth of a company?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a matter of how you pitch, right? Like, it's all about how you frame the business, and especially when you're pitching VCs, like traditional like funds, then you need to show them like this is going to be huge, right? For these reasons, and and it needs to make sense in their head. So it really comes down to pitching. Like, we did raise money, even though that like I don't think like a lot of people, you'll have a lot of no's, right? A lot of people tell you no's. Like I was talking about like the haters before. I didn't even get started on like the investor haters. Like like a lot of people say no, and especially anyone who raises money. I bet more people say no to you for almost anyone, even Pinterest, than have said yes. Unless you get to this certain like kind of magical moment where you're almost considered a unicorn.
Okay, questions?
Yeah, to the investors maybe directly. So did you approach them through Angel Pad, or was it like apart from the incubator that you like got the VC funding rolled on?
Yeah, so again, it's like there's a lot we could go into on pitching. I'd say like Angel Pad is one thing that did help us a lot, because it's basically looked at like investors are like, okay, so, there's always like the team, the market, and the company, and like, they're basically just thinking like, okay, like, so AngelPad vetted them, and then, if you get like a fund involved, then they're like, oh, okay, so like that fund's involved, I know these guys, and they've invested in Pinterest, and so like, okay, that sounds like a safe bet. And then, it's like, so you kind of build up this reputation, and sometimes you have to pull it from different places. Like my co-founder went to Harvard Business School. Or like we went through AngelPad. It doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it means something because they're like, oh, I've seen someone do something like this before through this avenue, right?
So you would always like advise founders to go through an accelerator, incubator to,
Yeah, it depends. It depends where you're at. I mean, again, if you like know what you're doing and and you're building this business and you're like, okay, like I see things working, and and maybe if you want to take on funding, like you could go that route. I think accelerators are helpful to kind of break into the scene though. Although that said, like there's a lot of accelerators out there, and and a lot of the good ones aren't easy to get into, right? Like I guess like the big, I'll throw AngelPad in there, but really the big AngelPad is not really scaling. Like big three, like 500, YC, TechCrunch or TechStars, and in those, like each of them are getting thousands of applications for every batch, and there's probably like with the exception of like YC and how big their last class was, like with 500, it's 30 spots. So it's that's a challenge, and I guess that's also leads to why that's an important part of the story, because you were able to beat out that many other companies and get in, and so yeah, it definitely comes down to what you can pull, and you just basically are pulling. You're repping yourself, and you're pulling these things around you, and you're like, hey, like here are these things, but also like this is why I'm killing it at this business.
One thing I think people don't talk a lot about is, accelerators and incubators are sort of buyer beware also, in that they're investors in your company, and even an incubator could give you a raw deal. So is that something you thought about going into AngelPad?
Yeah, definitely. So, we thought about AngelPad. We were like, okay, we actually selectively only applied to AngelPad. And so we were like, okay, this seems like we thought the program looked really legit. It was founded by all ex-Google people. At the time, I think they had like Buffer, maybe Postmates. They hadn't quite. There's Vungle and Mopub, and I don't know if anyone knows Mopub, but Mopub was like one of the largest accelerator acquisitions ever. I think they got bought by Twitter for like 300 million-ish. And so like it was before some of those things, but I think we saw some companies that were really doing well out of the program. Also, it was a co-working space, so we're like friends forever with a lot of the companies and founders that were in that. And there's only 12 companies, so even more selective, but we felt like more attention would be given to with less companies.
More questions?
You talked about some of the testing that some of the bigger e-commerce companies are doing, like Indochino and I think you said SK2. Have you seen any trends in smaller e-commerce companies that don't have as many resources, let's say as an Indochino that can have 24 pop-ups within a period of 2 years?
Yeah, so you were asking about the resources for smaller e-commerce companies. When you say resources, are there specific things, or is it like how to do it, or?
A smaller e-commerce company probably wouldn't have the funds to do 24 pop-ups in a 2-year period. Are you seeing any interesting trends that they're using within that segment?
Yeah, I think so. Other examples of companies that are maybe like starting out, a lot of people go into it and they're like, okay, like I'm hoping to break even on this my first time, because I don't know exactly what the experience I need to create, or like what exactly events I need to hold while it's open, or like where exactly the best location is. I can take the best guess, but I want to at least go for break even. So like Ministry of Supply is one example, a company that has used us a few times now, and they've gotten better as times went on. Another one's Combatant Gentlemen, which is another interesting company that like they call it like sheep to shirt. They like own the sheep. But they basically did that.
Did
They're
they
like,
trademark that? I hope they did.
I think so. I think if you go to their site, I think it's there still. Or I might have just come up with that in my head.
Oh my god.
But both of their examples are like, okay, we're gonna shoot to break even on this. We're gonna try to sell some products, try to get some brand awareness. We're gonna host an event like each night. We're gonna do like a weekend instead of like a week or a month. And so I think there's some ways you can kind of tailor it, offline experiences for that. But I mean, what you can do even before that is like understand your customer who's buying from you online. So you can try these different online channels, which are arguably more scalable, and then figure out who your customer is better. So then when you go offline, you know that, let's say like Bonobos or Bottle Bar, I think they've both done appointments, and so it's like appointment-driven stores. And like the Bonobos Guide Shop's still down here, and you can still set appointments. And Andy Dunn like swears by those stores. He's like, this is like one of the best things that we could have done for our business. And now, of course, they're like at that level, but like I think it's just like thinking about different tactics that are being used, and even before you go offline, like what are the e-commerce companies doing online for customer acquisition? How are they understanding their customers? And then people buying from you, then that kind of can direct you to what to do offline as well.
Stripes in the back.
How did you select your founding team, and then how did you make the decision to grow your employee base, and kind of where you're now? How did you choose full-time employees versus contractors, and those decisions?
Yeah. So the question is how to build a team. Very, very difficult question. So I mean, Eric and I, we worked together on a startup before. So we worked on this site called Social Earth. It's still around. We sold it for a small sum of money to a larger media company before starting Storefront. And basically that's how we met and how we decided to start thinking about Storefront together. And then through that experience, we hired from our network at first. And so we were like, okay, like these are people that we've worked with or we know, and they're really good at what they do. And so we convinced them to come on board, and a lot of them left jobs to do it. And then as time went on, now we're about 20 people. We had to start going outside of our networks. So sometimes we kind of go one connection out. And then as we need more specialized roles for different things, I mean, AngelList is huge for a tech company. AngelList is like a godsend. It's probably one of the best avenues out there to find good talent, and especially people that are like already in that startup mindset and hopefully know what it takes. But I mean, at the end of the day, you're like I was talking about Thumbtack earlier, like you're probably looking at like a 1 to 100 ratio of how many interviews or vets that you do to get to that one person. And it's super important. Like you also have to have an idea of what sort of culture you want to build, because you don't want to just like hire a bunch of people that like, different work styles and heterogeneity is like good, but like you don't want to hire a bunch of people that like can't work together either, or that you don't like to work with. So I think it kind of comes back to the founders. Like you need to love the people you work with, and you need to be thoughtful in bringing on people that you're just like so excited about, because you know that they like, can do the job, and also you love working with them. Usually helps when they know what they're doing.
Just to follow up on that, for your first employees, did you find that you always had to give equity, or were people willing?
Unless you have a lot of money to spend, equity is a nice counter to not paying people their full salary. Which is what you have to do, right? Like that's why it's equity, and also equity means they believe in what you're doing. But that said, I mean, if you have a one year cliff and 4 year vest, like most people generally do, that means they need to be with you a year before they even get that first fourth of their equity shares, and then then they get it as long as they stay with you after that. So like that's something to consider, right? Like even if you're giving them equity, they need to really prove themselves and be with you a while to actually get it.
You mentioned international brands and local makers that you work with. Do you have a specific target for who you want to cater to? Or is it like accessible for all people to use Storefront?
Yeah, so like kind of like the question we were talking about before, like home goods actually is kind of a very fast growing fourth category for us. But yeah, I mean, it's an open marketplace, so anyone can go there and approach a space owner and say, hey, here's what I want to do. Here's my profile. You can see what I've done in the past for pictures of my products. You know, if I've rented on storefront before, et cetera, et cetera. And so like anyone can go and approach these people, and having that profile is like a huge leap forward from just like cold calling someone or walking into someone's store and saying, hey, I'd like to do like something in here. And so, yeah, it's completely open for what you want to do. And I mean, as a business, as for us, like we've always shot for aspirational brands. Like early on, we wanted like the people that people want to be like, right? So sometimes that helps working with some of these larger brands, or sometimes it's like local brands that are doing something really interesting or have a really unique flavor. And like getting them involved with storefront kind of, you know, that sets the tone. You know, it's like you need to be unique. You need to have a really strong brand presence. You need to know what sort of experience you're going to create when you're offline, because that's the big thing in retail. Like I could buy all my stuff on Amazon if I wanted to, but why do people not do that? Because they still want to go and experience things. And so what is that brand experience? So I'd say like we target people that, you know, are trying to do things like that, but that said, I mean, that's not the only people we work with either.
What do you,
Sorry, go ahead.
how do you compare yourself to companies such as like pop-up stores who are doing kind of a similar thing? Are you trying to work with them, you said?
Yeah, so I mean, pop-up stores I'm familiar with, but I'm not, you know, like, I guess the thing to say is I think their angle is that they're trying to work with like established stores, which I guess the argument is like kind of a misnomer because we already do that. So I guess, I don't know, I mean, I guess there's a lot of like competitors and there's a lot of people that like also like follow what you're doing. It's, you know, it happens a lot. I mean, we've found people on like Odesk building a site, like found people on Odesk that had a profile, that also had a profile in storefront, and we could tell that they were scraping and like watching what we were doing. So I mean, that's just part of the thing. It's like once you build some notoriety, once you announce that you've raised funding, you're gonna have people following you. Also, sometimes that's an argument for why people raise venture capital, because if it's a big opportunity, you want to move faster than people because you don't want someone to like just come in and like I guess example would be like Indiegogo, right? Like I think like Indiegogo was around before Kickstarter, but Kickstarter just built this brand and moved a little bit faster. So I think that's kind of how I look at it. I think we're all kind of helping build the market. With a couple of our bigger competitors are in London, but at the end of the day, like, you know, we're just doing our thing and we're trying to be, you know, as good as we can. So it's like not really worth paying attention to kind of followers, because at the end of the day, like we're probably having to change faster and like, you know, and I guess maybe just to like maybe spread that to more general advice is like, if you are looking at a competitor that's a startup and you're copying what they're doing, it's probably not the right thing to do, because that startup's probably changing their approach, and so you're probably like 6 to 12 months behind them and they're already thinking about how they're changing next. So like, because startups generally, right, like the thing about startups, they don't necessarily know what they're doing. So, yeah.
So let's take 2 more questions and then we're gonna wrap it up so that I can give you guys some time to talk face to face with Tristan. So last 2 questions, guys.
So I'm wondering how you came to this particular space. Is there something in your background when the company dealing with real estate? I'm just wondering what drove you to that.
To General Assembly, why we?
No. I mean, what drew you to creating a storefront?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I basically I've always been interested. I'm very interested on the art side of things. So like I think it's something that like my parents were artists. I do my own art. Actually, I have some of my art up on Van Gogh, that company I mentioned earlier. So that's a good way of customer acquisition. But yeah, I mean that's what drew me to it. I mean, I see a lot of potential. So the thing I pulled away from Social Earth, my first kind of startup-y bootstrap thing, was urban innovation. Really passionate about urban innovation, and I think there's a huge opportunity with like vacant space, and I think there's way too much gray space in cities. You know, there's gray sidewalks, gray walls, chain link fence. It's like so much stuff out there that's like blasé, not interesting to look at. And as people living in San Francisco, if you guys live in San Francisco, we didn't decide to like, create that space. So I think open spaces, like vacant spaces, I think there's a lot of opportunities out there. And so that kind of combined with like, hey, I also love really creative people. How do I get the creative people into these spaces and also make sense as a business? That's kind of what motivated it. I mean, that said, I had a great partner too. I probably wouldn't have come to some of these same conclusions without my co-founders. So I think it's important to surround yourself again with people that think maybe slightly differently than you, but you love to work with.
Last question. Ooh, okay. We'll take both of you. In the front.
Okay.
And we'll push over.
Do you have a strategy for maintaining your brand's credibility or legitimacy and like making sure that the customers have great experiences with your company? When you said before that like as a middleman, it's hard to like control, like have total control because you have the store owners and the customers. Right?
Yeah. So like, how do we manage our brand with both customers?
Yeah, like you have a strategy for like your company because I mean there are always going to be problems with like store owners not responding or customers complaining and you can't control everything.
Yeah, exactly, right. And some customers are probably just not a good fit for your site, and so I think there's a lot of things like you can't control everything. But you can get smarter and keep iterating as you go. And so it's like, okay, like for example, store owners aren't responding to people. So we're like, okay, so let's look, we need automated emails that ping them at certain points, right? That like let them know, oh, someone submitted a request to you, someone's talking to you, right? Things like that. And then it evolves like, okay, maybe they're still not responding. Okay, maybe it's worth having an account manager in the short term actually like help coordinate this relationship. So there's a lot of things you can hack together on the back end and try to kind of keep getting smarter at what people need and what like helps them, react. Maybe you kick people off the site if they don't respond. They only respond to 50% of requests. We've definitely had to remove certain people to improve the quality. So I think it's something that you're constantly getting better at. But just because it's a startup, right? So you have to like make mistakes or not be perfect, and you're never really going to be perfect for a long time. I mean, businesses are actually probably never perfect. So, you just have to kind of do the best you can and then know who you're serving and serve them the best you can. Because some people, like I said, maybe just some people aren't a fit for the site, or maybe they're not the right stage of their business or what have you. We can't help every single person. Like, hey, I'm an artist. I don't have any money to spend on renting a store. All right, we can't help you.
But there's Kickstarter.
But yeah, there's Kickstarter.
Or Indiegogo.
Yeah, and so that's how that's a great point. Like that's how the business can evolve, right? And maybe at some point we offer some sort of financing so that even like the earliest of artists or like the worst funded of artists, the struggling or starving artists can still use our service because we know that we can get them at least this much sales and we can give them this sort of financing. Like an example, I don't know if anyone knows Rakuten. Giant, and it's like the Amazon of Japan, but they're actually also much more global than Amazon is. But they have their own, financing for all like the products, and it's like they've kind of built in this system where like they're almost like the #1 credit card, I think, in Japan or something like that. I don't know. So like it's like as you grow and scale, you can look at these other avenues of what's holding people back, but you have to kind of have a more narrow customer focus in the beginning. Thanks, guys.